At this point, we have a look at the actual text of John 1, 1-5. And what I'd like to do is just do two of the things I always do with a Greek text when I first come to it, apart from attempt to translate it. The first thing is to make observations about the text, and I mark it up on the text. It's one of the things that I find helpful. The second thing is to ask questions of the text that usually arise from those observations, so that when I come to read commentaries and the grammars and do some work with concordances and other things, the different tasks of exegesis, I've got something already there to work with. So I'll just do a rough and ready translation of the text so that we're on the same page, so to speak, as we look at it together. Now, John's Gospel opens with the words, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Very famous words. And the prologue of John is really the overture or the foyer of the Gospel. It introduces some of the main themes. If you understand the prologue well, you set yourself up very well to understand the whole of John's Gospel. So the first things I'd notice about this is the repetition of ein, the imperfect of the verb to be. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that carries on, actually, as we'll see as we go through the text. He was in the beginning with God. It's quite repetitious, isn't it? You can see several things being repeated. Through him all things were made, and apart from him, not one thing which was made was made. In him was life, and the light was the light of human beings, and the light in the darkness shines, and the darkness did not katalambano, it did not comprehend it, understand it, and sometimes it's translated overcome it, did not overcome it. So there's a question right there that we'll need to come back to, the meaning of this word katalambano. Now, in terms of observations, you've got these imperfect tense eins appearing regularly in the passage, and then the only present tense verb is phane, the light shining. It shines in the darkness. At this point, it's just an observation. Some other observations I would make in terms of repeated terms would be the fact that logos is here, then logos is repeated. And of course, the word God, theos, appears several times. We'll put a little line over the top to indicate that one. Here again. So these repeated terms are often very important because they underscore what the author of a text wants to emphasize. Some other observations would be the repetition of the verb ginomai. So you've got ageneto here, you've got ageneto here, you've got gegonen, not one thing, hen, one of the words for one in Greek, heis, mia, and hen, which was made apart from him. And then the language of light and darkness is important, I think. So you've got the language of life is followed up by light. Just do that there, and then light here. And then the opposite of light, of course, is darkness, and darkness gets repeated. Even this initial observation of the text indicates that it's more than just average prose, isn't it? You've got something here that you'd probably describe as elevated prose. Some commentators talk about it being poetry, in fact. The repetition is a very common feature of literary texts, such as poetry. Actually, I just have one more observation before we move on to the second step, which, as I mentioned earlier, is to ask questions of the text, and that is the repetition of arche, which is interesting. So you've got in the beginning was the Word, and then he was in the beginning. You've got that repeated. So a number of repeated terms. Now, in terms of exegesis, one of the tasks of exegesis is to what I would call take ambiguity away from the text, to disambiguate the text, to make clearer what the text is actually saying and what it means. And to take that step, you need to really raise the options for interpretation and then hopefully validate the best interpretation in your research activity. So let's have a look. The first thing that I would notice is that NRK sounds vaguely familiar, doesn't it? In the beginning. In the beginning, of course, is the first words of the Bible. So Genesis 1:1, in the beginning was God, and in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Here we have in the beginning was the Word. Mark 1:1 is also interesting because there it says, the beginning of the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So that kind of repetition is important in reading John because it does what literary critics call, it works as intertextuality. So there are former texts which John is drawing on explicitly through quotation, but also in this kind of way through allusion or echo. So NRK is itself the language of creation through Genesis 1, verse 1. Now, the first question I'd have for interpretation is, why does it say in the beginning? Why do most translations say in the beginning rather than in a beginning? Because after all, arche here is anarthrous. It doesn't have the definite article in Greek. That's one thing we'd like to think about. It says in the beginning was the Word. So the logos is obviously a very important term. It has a background in Jewish thought in Paul's day and outside of the Jewish world as well. Interestingly, though, the word logos doesn't appear as a title for Jesus anywhere else in the Gospel of John. So it's interesting that John introduces the title or the name so early. It gets repeated immediately, and the word was, this is usually translated with God. But if you were remembering your basic Greek, pros, the preposition pros normally means to or towards. So why do translations say, and the Word was with God rather than towards God? That's repeated down here in verse 2. Then, of course, the most important exegetical problem in the opening verse, and perhaps even in the whole Gospel, is also a theological one, because literally it says, and God was the Word. But you'll know from your translations it's never translated that way. It's translated almost universally in English translations as the Word was God. It's interesting, isn't it, that you'll see here this is, again, anarthrous. It doesn't say, and the Word was the God. It says the Word was God. So Jehovah's Witnesses translate this verse as the Word was a God. Why are we taking the word as the subject of the verb to be anyway? Why aren't we translating it as God or a God was the Word? So this is a particular construction in Greek grammar, which we'll come back to and which is in your notes, whereby the subject of the verb to be in these types of cases is after the verb to be, and it's got an article. And there are good reasons for saying that theos in this context should be translated as God, not as a God. If we keep moving, we've got the same problem in a question in verse 2, asking ourselves, why is this usually translated with God rather than to God? And then moving through the passage, there are several other fascinating exegetical problems that we'll need to address. Questions that are raised just by an initial reading of this text. For example, the word anthropos here in the plural, and the light was the light of anthropoi, or of men, or should it be translated generically? Should it be translated the light was the light of human beings? That's an exegetical problem worth considering. And the last one I'd like to mention is the question which attaches to the meaning of this verb. Does it mean, and the darkness did not overcome it, namely the light, who is Jesus, or does it mean the darkness did not comprehend or understand it? The language of light and darkness is another question mark I'd have for this passage. It's connected to life. So light and darkness in the context of NRK is something that you would think of in creation terms, let there be light, as Genesis 1 puts it. But as we move through the gospel, we'll see that John transforms the language of light and darkness from creation to redemption, such that Jesus, as the light of the world, as it says in chapter 8 of John, is really about him bringing salvation rather than creation, new creation. So that's a basic approach to the text, a quick orientation to these verses in Greek. It's the kind of thing I think all of you can do. It's a very simple task which sets yourself up to then take the more difficult steps of exegesis, making observations of the text and then asking simple questions of the text. At this point, we'll move into the notes, which answer some of those questions.